Okay, uh, what I'm going to present is from the years of our uh, vegetable farming, the information that I feel is worthwhile for weed pressure management and at the same time managing the weeds when they emerge. So for us, we really try to understand what our weed situation is. We identify the weeds, and as we've never bought a new farm, they've all been used. There's always a history of weeds and cultivation and uh, good management and poor management. And so we try to establish the perennials, annuals, and to prepare for that. This slide deals with how our weeds come to be, and uh, I'll fess up that I've brought in the majority of the weeds that are our biggest problem on this farm, either through uh, poorly composted manure or manure itself, or seed that was not properly cleaned, like in the 1970s. I have a neighbor who has, uh, I'll say, somewhere between 400 and 600 cattle, depending upon the economic conditions and situation, and he's on less than 30 acres of land. So his waste product is his problem, and it's to our advantage to work with him to bring the manure in when he can get the manure moved. And as a dairy farmer, he's never enough hours in the daytime to get things done. So I work with him, and we set up a fairly good sized composting operation, but sometimes he'll bring manure in on soil that is open and prepared for manure, particularly in the fall or early spring. And I should mention our acreage varies in terms of tillage from 80 to 120, and we try to have about 30% of that in green manure or stale bed or just off season, one season off. I'm going to go back, I missed that one. I grew up in a truck farming region south of Minneapolis, St. Paul, in the 1950s and 60s. And on the school bus, which was a rural suburban fringe interface, uh, the farm kids looking out the window, whether it was in fall or spring, would pass judgment on how clean fields were kept. And some cases, the farmers were bringing in manure from our stockyards in South St. Paul, and on the edges of the fields, you'd see a scene like this, pigweed in particular. And because it was brought in from a stockyards, which had manure and animals coming in from Montana, North Dakota, even as far away as Nebraska, we had every imaginable weed in our bioregion, in our township and our county. So as a kid hired out to work on vegetable farms and weed, I had a fairly good handle on identification and what weeds really not to allow to go to seed, that there always was an emphasis on identifying what our future would be, say in the case of this amaranth plant with close to 500,000 seeds. So for us, we were really on top of prevention and our awareness of weeds. And in particular, our vegetable system with the one full year invested in both green manure, fertility building, as well as weed seed bank being lessened and in some cases eliminated. That being our focus, and we really tried to emphasize that with our apprentices and with our help. So over the years, from the 60s, 70s, I watched as we moved both in a row crop agricultural system from moldboard plowing to a minimal tillage system, how weeds and their population and numbers increased and decreased. And on our farm, we quit moldboard plowing in the mid 1980s, and we went to a chisel plow predominantly, as well as field cultivators and also a shallow cultivation. And what we realized was that we had in the soil inherently a seed presence from the weeds. And what we tried to do was set the farm up so when we were cultivating, we were cultivating shallow to a shallow depth, or if we were having that year off, we were actually going deeper and bringing what we felt was a higher percent of that weed seed to the surface for germination. So here we have reducing the seed bank, and in this case, if you look in the background, you can see some sweet corn. So that's about, I suppose, 6 to 10 leaf stage. So this would be well into the middle of June for us, having that been planted in late April. So we had this field for a total season off, and we had used a field digger like this, a Glencoe digger, with a mulch bar, and we had a thistle problem in this field when we first ran the farm, and we were able to get the thistles up, but we still had some winter annuals like shepherd's purse and even dandelions. So for this season, we used the Glencoe digger, and we used our mulch bar to lay them out. We brought them up to the weed seed exposure, and we probably worked this field 3 times like this. And we liked to go into this preparation mid-June, and when we had weather patterns that were somewhat predictable with the heat and the lack of rain here in Minnesota, our bioregion, we would dry out, and around the 4th of July, that would be the hottest temperature for our season. And we could get germination with adequate moisture, and for the most part, eliminate weed seeds from this depth. You can see the cotyledons having been developed, and yet they're able to be exposed, the root, and laid out. This is actually a field that's being cultivated alongside what looks to be a coal crop. So in this case, we have Canada thistle. It's probably our worst perennial crop here in Minnesota. And when Canada thistle is hoed or cut, it will branch out and follow a lateral formation, and it makes it quite difficult to eradicate it. For us, our most successful method was to cover the thistle crop with our Sudan grass, and that was a warm season planting, so we did that in starting usually first week of June, and we then would cut the Sudan grass as often as every 3 weeks. So it's possible we would have 3 to 4 cuttings of Sudan grass, and that for the most part worked well for us. And again, by the fall, we noticed that the perennial Canada thistle had lost its energy and strength, and the Sudan grass was left on as a fall winter mulch. When we transitioned 20 acres of our farm in the early 1990s, we had a wet zone on the farm. Oh, this one's moving too fast. Okay, and again, we used that same time of the season, the hot, dry portion of the summer, to bring up the quackgrass. And we exposed it, the rhizomes, the roots, and in one season we were able, in a month's time, 4 weeks, possibly 6 weeks, to expose it in the late June, July stage and bring it to the surface with success. This is sort of our philosophy for the perennials. I should mention that there is a herbicide that's allowable in organic standards. We don't use it. I do get asked about it, more so from home gardeners, and we haven't used it, so I can't speak from any experience saying that it's been successful. On the upper left, we're mowing down a rye crop, and on the lower portion you can see some annual weeds coming through a fairly thick planting. So with our onions in beds, we had to ensure that they were going into being transplanted into soil that was prepared and, for the most part, a very low weed pressure. And I believe I've got a slide with the budding basket weeder. Let's see. Here we go. Budding basket weeder from Michigan, and it's mounted on a 140 farm wall. And in this slide, what we're doing is having a designated seed bed set up for our brassicas. For our broccoli, cabbage, not our kale. Our kale was started in the greenhouses, but we started what was referred to as a bare root transplant system, which is what I grew up with in the Twin City area. These beds would be prepared in the spring, and shallowly we would work them less than an inch, and we would monitor and work the soil. As soon as we saw below surface what weeds were starting to germ and emerge, and expose them. Some people have done this system with the rake on the right. We have friends that use this system also for carrots, and it works well for them. This is our brassica crop, which we'll transplant out. In the aisles, and you can see inside there is some purslane, and in this particular bed we were not sure why we had purslane. We didn't think it came in with the seed. We never had that issue before, and it turned out that we had a purslane summer, which it seems everybody in our bioregion was having an expression of purslane. Curious if anyone's ever had that situation. On the left-hand side is a hand-seeded with an earthway system, the one Elliot Coleman has in his book for our brassica seed, broccoli in this case. And these plants then would be pulled for bare root transplants all the way starting in late June right until the middle of August. So I'll just reiterate what I've talked about. Understand your weeds, identify them, and you can actually use weeds to regenerate your degraded soils. You have to manage them so they don't go to seed. But at the same time, prevention is the long-term management, whether that is watching what's coming through your farm gate in the terms of manure, compost, or even weed seed. We've always, the two here in red, 4 and 5, we've always tried to focus on these two, where we're reducing the seed bed before planting the crop. And because we're oftentimes planting a crop that's in a sequential planting, we start early and do our best to monitor weed issues. And then the stale bed field preparation, which we had photos of before. We were in a 4 to 6 year crop rotation. Again, 30% of our acreage had a full year off, and sometimes that extended into a fall cover crop, such as vetch, which we then would incorporate in late May. Canopy referring to certain crops like the Sudan grass, and for that matter, buckwheat, where we're choking out or cutting off the sun to the crops. Let's see, the mechanical, we have a primary and secondary tillage. So in both of these, and the example was when moldboard plowing with primary tillage, they were essentially plowing down what weed seeds were on the surface. They had a black cover, but nonetheless, they had buried generations of weeds and seeds below. So what we try to do is focus on weeding the soil and hopefully not have to put much energy into weeding the crop. And we do follow up in case that we do have a weed flush or pressure with cultivation from 1 row to 4 row cultivators, tractor mounted. We also do mulching alongside of our tomato plants, peppers, and kale. We do use propane, and we do hire people to go out and hoe.